Let's make Africa the tree of life. Let's make Africa the tree of life.
Hello, welcome to Josh Moment. So in today's episode, we'll be looking at the Scramble and Partition of Africa. Did you know there was a time in Africa's history where a group of European powers sat at a conference? Then they divided Africa among themselves. Anyway, so that's what we'll be talking about in today's episode. So if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video. So without much talking, let's start today's episode. And our topic for today is the Scramble and Partition of Africa. So the Scramble for Africa denotes a concentrated period of intense European imperial expansion. This era was characterized by the invasion, conquest, colonization, and the vast majority of African continent by a select group of European or Western European powers. The principal powers involved included Belgium, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. This aggressive expansion was a direct consequence of the Second Industrial Revolution in Europe, which fueled European ambition and capability during the late 19th century and early 20th century. The period of the Scramble is generally understood to have commenced around the 1880s and concluded with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Prior to 1880s, European presence in Africa was largely confined to coastal regions and the southern part of the continent, with approximately 10% of the land formerly under European control by 1870. However, by 1914, this figure had dramatically escalated to nearly 90%, signifying a profound and rapid transformation of the continent's political landscape. This rapid expansion and ninefold increase in controlled territory within roughly 4 decades indicate a fundamental shift in European imperial strategy, moving beyond earlier patterns of trade and limited coastal settlement to a distinct accelerated phase of direct territorial acquisition. While all participating European nations secured holdings, Britain and France ultimately established the largest colonial empires in Africa. So let's look at the in-depth or the overview of this new imperialism. So the Scramble for Africa stands as a quintessential manifestation of new imperialism, a distinct phase of global expansion that had differed from earlier forms of colonialism. This era was characterized by an intensified focus on building vast empires through direct territorial conquest, military subjugation, and the systematic exploitation of resources in the colonized lands. The underlying motivation for this renewed wave of imperialism were diverse, encompassing fierce rivalry among the great European powers, an escalating economic drive for new resources and markets, and the pervasive belief in a civilizing mission. The unprecedented speed and scale of African partition compared to centuries of more limited European engagement underscored the emergence of new, powerful catalysts that transformed the nature of European interaction from informal influence to comprehensive political and economic domination. So let's look at the driving forces behind the Scramble and Partition of Africa. So the rapid and extensive colonization of Africa was propelled by a confluence of powerful economic, political, technological, and ideological factors, each reinforcing the other in a complex feedback loop. So let's look at the economic factors that propelled or influenced the Scramble for Africa. So under the economic factors, we have raw materials, market, and investment. So let's look at all these points and then how they contributed to the scramble and partition of Africa. So the demand of the second industrial revolution in Europe were a primary engine behind the scramble. This period of intense industrialization created an insatiable need for raw materials that were either scarce or expensive in Europe. Africa, with its abundant resources such as rubber, it was vital for the beckoning automotive industry. And to some of us, or to those of us who are yet to know the use of the rubber plant, it is used in manufacturing car tires. Yes. So way before time immemorial, the Europeans had advanced or considered the thought of advancing very early. So yes, so the vital beckoning automotive industry, various metal, copper, cotton, minerals, and exotic agricultural products like palm oil, cocoa, and cotton became an extremely attractive target to the European powers. The discovery of vast mineral wealth, including gold in Witwater sand and the diamond in Kimberley, further intensified this demand, promising immense profits. Beyond raw materials, Europeans faced a challenge of industrial overproduction, leading to an excess of manufactured goods that domestic markets could no longer absorb. So Africa was perceived as a vast untapped market for these surplus goods, from textiles to weapons. Further, European capitalists sought new and profitable investment outlets abroad as the traditional market became saturated. Colonial ventures offered the promise of high returns on investment, attracting financiers and leading to speculation in African resources on European stock exchange. This is very interesting considering the age. Anyway, let's continue. This economic drive was also intertwined with a growing sense of economic nationalism, where nations believed that strength and superiority were derived from self-sufficient empires with captive colonial markets. The interplay between the demand of the second industrial revolution and the saturation of European domestic economics or economies created a powerful economic impetus or economic scenario that directly propelled the scramble for Africa, transforming it from a search for resources into a necessity for sustaining and expanding the capitalist system in Europe. So let's look at the political ambitions and international rivalry that propelled to the scramble and partition of Africa. So we are looking at the factors that propelled the scramble and partition of Africa. And then we've checked the economic, which we have raw material, markets, and investment. So let's look at the political ambitions and international rivalry. So the acquisition of territories in Africa was deeply intertwined with national prestige and the pursuit of global power. In an era of intense competition among European states, colonial possessions serve as tangible symbols of a nation's strength and influence on the world stage. King Leopold II of Belgium's aggressive pursuit of personal riches and political influence in the Congo region acted as a significant catalyst, sparking a competitive rush among other European powers who feared being left behind. Wow. The unification of Germany or German state in 1871, creating a new and powerful unified Germany, fundamentally altered the European balance of power. This new rival intensified geopolitical competition with established colonial powers like Britain and France further fueling their interest in expanding the African holdings. The fear of exclusion from strategically or economically valuable territories compelled nations, even those initially less interested, to stake their own claims. When others such as France and Portugal began to expand their presence. Control over this territory also offered crucial strategic advantage, such as Britain's desire for stop over ports along the vital route to its vast empire in India. So let's look at the technological factors that propelled the scramble and partition of Africa. So under the technological factors, we have medicine, transportation, communication, and weaponry. So let's look at all these factors and how they contributed to the partition. So technological advancements were not merely coincidental, but were critical preconditions that enabled the unprecedented scale and speed of the scramble. Without these innovations, the deep inland penetration and rapid control that characterized the period would have been vastly different. So let's look at the transportation, the role transportation played. So under transportation, the introduction of steam power and significant advancement in boat building technology, such as the development of iron ships, revolutionized European access to the African interior. So the development of the iron ship changed or helped Europeans to access the African interior. So steamships allow troops and merchants to navigate deep inland via major rivers systems like the Congo and Niger River, overcoming geographical barriers that had previously confined European presence to the coastal areas. This capability transformed the feasibility of large-scale inland colonization from a theoretical possibility to a practical reality. So let's look at the role medicine played in the scramble, or under, yes. So medicine, which is the technological factors. So we've checked transportation, now let's check medicine. So prior to the mid-19th century, large parts of Africa were virtually uninhabitable for Europeans due to high mortality rates from tropical diseases, particularly the infamous malaria. The widespread use of quinine, an effective treatment for malaria, isolated, uh, yes, discovered in the 1850s, dramatically reduced European vulnerability to malaria or these diseases. This medical breakthrough made vast expanses of the African interior accessible and safer for sustained European presence, directly addressing a primary logistical and health obstacle to colonization. So that was the role medicine played, the discovery of quinine in the 1850s. So let's look at weaponry under technological factors. So European armies possess a decisive military advantage due to superior weaponry. Development in firearms, including the breech loading and magazine loading rifles, and the invention of the magazine gun provided European forces with significantly higher rates of fire and destructive capability. The introduction of smokeless gunpowder further enhanced their tactical superiority. This technological disparity allowed European powers to overcome resistance from indigenous people more effectively, securing newly claimed territories for decades. So let's look at communication under technological factors. So under communication, improvement in communication such as telegraph also played a role in facilitating more efficient exploration and control of African territories. The combined effect of medical and transportation technologies directly address the primary logistics and health obstacles, and transforming the feasibility of large-scale inland colonization into practical reality, while superior weaponry ensured military dominance. So let's look at the ideological factors, or the ideological factor behind the scramble and partition of Africa. So ideologically, there are two factors: the civilizing mission and social Darwinism. So beyond economic and political drivers, European expansion was underpinned by powerful ideological justifications. A pervasive belief in European cultural superiority rationalized colonization as a civilizing mission. This narrative posited that Europeans had a moral duty to bring their values, education, and particularly Christianity to what they perceived as backward societies. So that was how they thought Africa was backward in their own weight. Yeah. So let's move on. Christian missionaries played a significant role in this, often genuinely believing in the spread of what they considered the only true or the only truly religion. Imperialist ideologies, including social Darwinism, further contributed to this justification. This theory suggested a natural hierarchy of races, with Europeans at the apex or with the Europeans at the top, thereby legitimizing their dominance and control over other people. However, modern historical analysis suggests that these claims of humanitarianism were often insincere or served as a convenient pretext for their territorial or for European territorial expansion in Africa, with racial and cultural supremacism being the truly underlying drivers of these actions. This complex interplay of economic pressures, political rivalries, technological enablement, and ideological rationalization created a powerful, self-sustaining momentum for the colonization of Africa. So let's look at the conference that formalized European colonization or European partition and scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. And this conference was what formalized European colonization of Africa. So let's look at the Berlin Conference. Let's look at the purpose and the participants thereof. So the Berlin Conference, convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck from November 1884 to February 1885, marked a pivotal moment in the scramble for Africa. Its primary objective was to establish a set of rules for the colonization and trade in Africa, specifically to resolve the escalating conflict and competing imperial interests among European powers, thereby preventing a larger war among themselves. Wow. A representative from 14 nations attended the conference. Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal emerging as the chief stakeholders, already controlling most African territories. Notably, the United States also participated, but ultimately did not sign the final treaty because of a growing interest of anti-imperialist sentiment in its domestic politics. So let's look at some of the key agreements of the Berlin Conference, otherwise known as the General Act of Berlin. So the conference culminated in the signing of the General Act of Berlin, a comprehensive agreement that regulated European colonization and trade across the continent of Africa. Key principles and outcomes established by this act included: 1. The principle of effective occupation. So let's look at this principle of effective occupation. So this crucial principle stipulated that any European nation claiming a new portion of the African coast or assuming a protectorate had to notify other signatory power and then demonstrate effective occupation. This meant establishing actual control and administrative structures in the region rather than merely staking a flag. This provision directly spurred a rapid rush to build outposts, sign treaties, often through manipulation or violence, with local leaders and set up colonial governments. So let's look at the second General Act of Berlin, free trade. The signatory powers agreed to allow free trade throughout the vast Congo basin, as well as Lake Malawi and areas to its east. Free navigation. So under free navigation, the major rivers of the continent, specifically the Niger and Congo rivers, were declared free for international ship traffic. Let's look at the Congo Free State. So the property occupied by King Leopold II of Belgium's International Congo Society were officially recognized and confirmed as the society effectively, or the society asserted or granted King Leopold II of Belgium direct rule over the vast Congo region, which later became known as the Congo Free State. So the Congo region became a personal property of King Leopold II at a point in time before later the Belgian government took over. So let's continue. And then the last of the General Acts of Berlin is the abolition of slave trade. So to gain broader public acceptance and present an humanitarian facade, the conference included an international prohibition of the slave trade within the European powers' respective sphere of influence. So in order to establish or ground the Scramble and Partition, the slave trade needed to be abolished so that the Scramble took over effectively and properly. So the strange part of this whole scenario or happening was the absence of an African representative. So let's look at the absence of African representative during the Berlin Conference. So a profound, significant, and often criticized aspect of the Berlin Conference was the complete exclusion of African leaders from the proceedings. This omission starkly highlighted the profound disregard for African sovereignty by European powers. Existing political structures, cultures, and the need of indigenous population were disregarded. The arbitrary borders drawn during the conference and subsequently finalized in bilateral agreements frequently ignored existing ethnic cultural divisions or ignored existing ethnic groups, cultural divisions, laying the groundwork for future conflict. So if you come to Ghana, there are some areas in Ghana and there are some areas in Togo. If you go to Burundi or the case of Rwanda and Congo, Hutu and the Tutsi ethnic group, they are one people, but colonialism and several places across the continent could see one ethnic group being divided, one in one country, one in another country. And the strange part is the case of the Gambia. The Gambia is a country within Senegal. And if you look at the Senegal and Gambia map, Gambia is actually in Senegal. Yet Gambia is different from Senegal. Let's continue anyway. The Berlin Conference is often perceived as the starting point of the scramble, but a more accurate assessment reveals it as a formalizing and accelerating mechanism. The conference did not initiate colonization, which was already underway, but rather provided a legalistic framework that intensified the pace and reduced diplomatic friction among European powers during the ongoing land grab in Africa. The principle of effective occupation, for instance, directly spurred the rapid establishment of outposts and colonial administrations on the continent or across the continent of Africa. The formalization of claims achieved at the direct expense of African self-determination legalized the dispossession of an entire continent. The peace achieved among European powers was attained by prioritizing their own stability over the well-being and autonomy of the African societies, demonstrating the inherent injustice at the core of the partition. So let's look at the partition in practice. European territorial acquisitions after the Berlin Conference. So following the formalization of rules at the Berlin Conference, European nations rapidly moved to assert control over a vast sweep of Africa, each carving out its own sphere of influence. So by 1914, the transformation was nearly complete, with almost the entire continent falling under European colonial rule. This near complete absorption of the African continent into European empires by 1914, leaving only two independent states, underscores the unprecedented scale of territorial dispossession and the profound shift in global power dynamics during this period. So let's look at the major colonial powers and their dominant regions. So the principal European powers acquired extensive territories which were then administered as colonies or protectorates. United Kingdom. So let's look at the colonies of United Kingdom. So let's look at British colony after the partition. So United Kingdom established control over significant regions, including, so these were the territories Great Britain or the United Kingdom secured during the partition. We have, so under the United Kingdom's colonies, there were Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, and a large part of West Africa, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, the Gambia. So let's look at France colonies or the French protectorate after the Scramble. So France claimed vast areas in North and West Africa, notably Algeria, Senegal, French Sudan, now Mali, Mauritania, Niger, French Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and the Kingdom of Dahomey, now Benin. French holdings also extended to French Equatorial Africa, now Gabon, Republic of Congo, Chad, Central African Republic, Madagascar, and French Somaliland, now Djibouti. So let's look at Belgium's holdings after the Scramble and the partition. So with Belgium's holding, under King Leopold II, Belgium gained direct rule over the immense Congo region, which became the Congo Free State. This territory was particularly notorious for its brutal exploitation of rubber and other resources, leading to widespread human rights abuses and the death of millions of indigenous people. And it is estimated over 10 million people died during the Congo Free State rule under King Leopold II of Belgium. Let's continue. The nature and severity of colonial rule varied significantly among European powers, with Leopold II's Congo Free States standing out as an egregious example of extreme exploitation. So let's look at Germany's holdings after the partition. So Germany acquired significant territories including German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and then German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, Cameroon, and Togoland. So let's look at Portugal's colonies after the partition. So Portugal maintained and expanded its long-standing presence in Angola and Mozambique. Portugal also held Portuguese Guinea, now Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, and Sao Tome and Principe. Let's look at Italy's holdings or colonies after the partition. So Italy claimed Italian Somaliland, now Somalia, and Eritrea. Italy will later or briefly occupy Ethiopia in 1936. So let's look at Spain's holding. So Spain held smaller territories in Northwest Africa and Equatorial Guinea. So the entire of the African continent came under European rule by 1914, with the exception of two nations or countries. So let's look at the exceptions or the exclusions from this partition and scramble. These two nations that were exempted from the partition and the scramble. So amidst the widespread European annexation, only two African nations managed to retain their independence from direct colonial rule by 1914. Liberia and Ethiopia are these nations. Ethiopia's independence was notably secured through its decisive military victory over invading Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Liberia's unique status was largely contributed to its strong historical connection with the United States, having been founded for freed American slaves. These two exceptions stand as a testament to successful resistance and unique geopolitical circumstance in an otherwise completely partitioned continent. So let's look at some of the resistance or the African resistance to this partition. Okay, let's look at African resistance to the colonial rule. So the European conquest of Africa was not met with passive acceptance. Rather, it provoked widespread and diverse forms of African resistance. Because it's interesting how you divide us among yourself in your country and they come to take over without knowledge. So obviously the African was going to resist in a way. So this resistance encompassing armed rebellion, passive defiance, and political activism varied significantly depending on the local context, the nature of European depending on the local context, the nature of European colonial policies, and the leadership that emerged. These efforts demonstrate significant African agency and resilience in the face of overwhelming European military and technological superiority, challenging any narrative of passive submission. But eventually, they were taken over. The Europeans took over the continent. So, yes, they made an effort, but once the effort couldn't impact the decisions of the Europeans, it wouldn't be noticed as an effort. Anyway, let's continue. So let's look at some of these forms of resistance. So African people employed a range of strategies to oppose European imperialism. Traditional leaders often rallied their communities to defend ancestral land and sovereignty, while emerging nationalist movements sought broader political rights and self-determination. The resistance was characterized by its adaptability, with different groups employing tactics best suited to their circumstances, from direct military confrontation to more subtle form of non-cooperation. Notable resistance movements and their leaders thereof. So let's look at some of the notable resistance movements and the leaders that led this resistance, or the nations that led this or these resistance. So several key moments and leaders stand out in the history of African resistance, each illustrating the determination and often tragic outcome of these struggles. So let's look at the European victory at Adwa, which was a form of resistance to the Italian army. So this happened in 1896. So this was a landmark event in the history of African resistance. On March 1st, 1896, Emperor Menelik II led Ethiopian forces to a decisive victory over invading Italian forces at the Battle of Adwa. This crushing defeat thwarted Italy's colonial ambition in the Horn of Africa and ensured Ethiopia's continued independence, making it a powerful symbol of African resistance against colonization and altering European perception of African capabilities. And then let's look at resistance by Samori Toure of West Africa from 1882 to 1898. That was the rule of Samori Toure. So let's look at his form of resistance to European subjugation, suppression, or colonial rule. As the formidable founder of the Wasulu Empire, Samori Toure led a fierce and highly organized resistance against French colonial expansion in West Africa. He employed innovative military strategies including prolonged guerrilla tactics, the strategic incorporation of modern weaponry, and the forging of alliances with neighboring tribes. His forces successfully held out against superior French military power for over a decade. Although eventually captured in 1898, Samori Toure's resistance and strategic acumen inspired future independence movement across the continent of Africa. So let's look at another resistance movement with its leader, the Mahdist War of Sudan from 1881 to 1899. So led by Muhammad Ahmad, who proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the guided one of Islam. This religiously inspired movement launched a powerful rebellion against the Egyptian and later British forces in Sudan. The Mahdists successfully overthrew the Ottoman Egyptian administration, establishing their own state and demonstrating formidable military prowess against technologically superior European forces, driven by a fanatical fighting spirit. Despite their initial successes, Anglo-Egyptian forces eventually conquered Sudan in 1898, leading to the collapse of the Mahdist state. So let's look at another resistance, the Maji Rebellion to German occupation of German East Africa from 1905 to 1907. So this armed rebellion against German colonial rule in modern-day Tanzania was triggered by oppressive German policies, particularly the imposition of forced cotton cultivation for export. Insurgents, united by the spirit medium Kinjekitile Ngwale and a belief that Maji means sacred water, would turn German bullets into water, attack German outposts, and destroy cotton crops. The rebellion was met with brutal suppression by German forces, employing scorched earth policies that deliberately caused a devastating famine. This resulted in a massive loss of life, with estimates ranging from 75,000 to 300,000 deaths, overwhelmingly from starvation. So let's look at another resistance from the Herero and Namakwa, or let's look at the Herero and the Namakwa genocide. This was also in German Southwest Africa from 1904 to 1908. So uprisings by the Herero and the Nama people against land dispossession and the harsh realities of German colonial rule in modern-day Namibia were met with extreme violence and oppression. German General Luther von Trotha issued an extermination order leading to mass killing, forced starvation, and internment in concentration camps. This campaign resulted in the death of approximately 65 to 85% of the Herero population, and 10,000 Nama dead as well. And this is recognized as one of the earliest genocides of the 21st century or the 20th century. So let's look at another resistance, this time from the southern part of the continent, the Zulu Wars, Southern Africa, from in 1879. So the Zulu Kingdom mounted fierce resistance against British encroachment in Southern Africa. Despite an initial decisive Zulu victory at the Battle of Isandlwana, the British ultimately defeated King Cetshwayo's forces, leading to the incorporation of the Zulu Kingdom into British colonial holdings. The spread and diverse forms of African resistance, from military victories to prolonged guerrilla campaigns and spiritual movements, demonstrates significant African agency and resilience in the face of overwhelming European military and technological superiority. This moves beyond simply acknowledging resistance to emphasizing the strategic thinking, mobilization, and shared determination of the African people, highlighting their active role in shaping the colonial encounter, even in defeat. However, the extreme violence employed by European powers in suppressing African resistance included, or the European violence employed against the African, including scorched earth tactics and genocidal campaigns, reveals the brutal and often genocidal nature of colonial conquest, exposing the stark reality behind the civilizing rhetoric. So let's look at some of the consequences of the scramble and partition of Africa on the continent of Africa today, the long-term consequences for Africa. So the scramble and partition of Africa left an indelible and profound negative mark on the continent of Africa, shaping its economic, political, and social landscape for generations to come. The consequences extended far beyond the colonial period, contributing to many of the challenges faced by African nations even in recent times. So let's look at some of these consequences, and we start with the one, economic exploitation. So let's look at economic exploitation and underdevelopment as one of the long-term consequences of the scramble and partition for Africa. So colonial powers systematically established extractive economic systems designed primarily to serve imperial interests, transforming African colonies into mere suppliers of raw material for European industries. Precious metals, timber, rubber, oil, ivory, and cash crops like cotton, coffee, and palm oil were extracted and shipped to Europe, enriching the colonial powers while preventing Africa from developing its own diversified industries and hindering indigenous economic growth. African farmers were frequently coerced or compelled to abandon subsistence agriculture in favor of growing cash crops for export, a policy that often led to local food shortages and devastating famines. To ensure a steady supply of cheap labor for mines, plantations, and other enterprises, colonial powers implemented brutal systems of forced labor and taxation, causing immense suffering and social disruption. The infrastructure developed during this period, such as ports, railway, and roads, was strategically designed to facilitate the efficient extraction of resources for European benefit rather than to integrate African economies. This economic legacy has resulted in deeply entrenched long-term dependency on primary commodity exports, making many African nations vulnerable to the volatility of global commodity markets, and significantly hampering effort towards industrialization and economic diversification. This structural disadvantage has contributed to persistent economic disparities, widespread poverty, and ongoing underdevelopment across the continent of Africa. The economic impact of the scramble thus extended beyond mere resource extraction. It fundamentally restructured African economies to serve European industrial needs, thereby preventing indigenous industrialization and creating a deeply entrenched long-term dependency on primary commodity exports. So let's look at another long-term consequences, this time around political instability and the legacy of arbitrary borders. So European powers seized land by force, leading to a profound loss of independence and sovereignty for nearly the entire continent of Africa. Traditional African political systems were systematically dismantled, and indigenous leadership was replaced with foreign rulers who often had little to no understanding of local customs or concerns. A particularly enduring consequences of the scramble is the legacy of arbitrary borders. So prior to the scramble, Africans were living in kingdoms, empire, chiefdoms. There wasn't anything like border. And if one was attacked by an enemy, they could fall on the other ethnic group or the other kingdom or form alliance. And then the scramble created all these borders we see today. One fascinating one to me has always been how the Gambia is a country within Senegal. How? Anyway, let's continue. So this structural disadvantage has contributed to persistent economic. Yes, we've checked that. So let's look at the political instability and the legacy of the arbitrary borders. So a particularly enduring consequences of the scramble is the legacy of arbitrary borders. The boundaries drawn during the Berlin Conference and subsequent bilateral agreements were established with little to no regard for pre-existing ethnic, cultural, or political entities. This artificial demarcation is a direct and primary cause of much of Africa's post-colonial political instability and ethnic conflict. It led to ethnic fragmentation as communities were split across new states or distinct, often rival groups were forced together within new political entities, creating tensions that continue to persist to this day on the continent of Africa. Notable examples include the Nigerian Civil War of 1967 to 1970, the secession of South Sudan in 2011, an ongoing conflict between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, all of which have roots in these colonial era divisions, like I said earlier. So let's continue. Further, the artificial design of colonies resulted in many African countries having peculiar shape and sizes, some unusually tiny, like Sierra Leone, and my favorite, the Gambia. Others absurdly large, like Sudan, Mauritania, Egypt, which has limited the state's effective reach beyond its capital and weakened law enforcement, contributing to low state capacity. The imposition of governance system designed solely for imperial control and resource extraction with virtually no political representation of indigenous subjects fostered a deep mistrust of the state in post-colonial societies. This structural deficit in governance and a deep-seated lack of legitimacy continue to plague many post-colonial African nations, contributing to persistent governance challenges, including political instability, corruption, and frequent coups. So let's look at the social and cultural disruption as a long-term effect of the scramble and partition of Africa. So colonialism profoundly disrupted traditional African societies, leading to the displacement of communities, the undermining of traditional political and social structures, and the erosion of rural life through policies of taxation, forced labor migration, and urbanization. The imposition of European education and religion, particularly Christianity, aimed to replace indigenous knowledge system, religions, and cultural practices, often leading to their suppression or marginalization. This cultural imposition created tensions within communities and between generations as some Africans selectively adopted new practices. The colonial experience also led to the emergence of new social class, with a small elite of Africans trained in European language and administrative skills serving as intermediaries between European or colonial authorities and the broader African population, further altering existing social hierarchies. So in these cases, people who were ruling or leaders were replaced with ordinary elite people, giving no regard to authority or hierarchy. Anyway, let's continue. Overall, evidence suggests that the welfare of African population was significantly reduced due to factors such as forced labor, conflict, and the spread of infectious diseases facilitated by new trade contacts and colonial movement. So let's look at the enduring challenges of the scramble and partition in post-colonial Africa. So the legacies of the scramble continue to cast a significant shadow on contemporary African realities. Post-colonial African nations grapple with persistent challenges, including widespread poverty, profound inequality, systemic corruption, and ongoing conflict. The difficulties of nation building, the struggle for inclusive development, and the pursuit of justice and self-determination are often compounded by the inherited political and economic structure during the colonial era. Some analysis even point to a new scramble for Africa, where major global powers continue to compete for influence on the continent, perpetuating patterns of external involvement and resource competition. This indicates the historical forces set in motion by the scramble. Yes, okay. So this indicates the historical forces set in motion by the scramble continue to influence geopolitical dynamics and development trajectories in Africa today. So in conclusion, the enduring shadow of the scramble and partition of Africa represents a transformative and profound disruptive chapter in global history, driven by a complex interplay of European economic imperative, political ambitions, and technological advancement, all rationalized by prevailing ideologies of cultural superiority. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, whilst often seen as the starting point, was more accurately a formalizing mechanism that accelerated an already unfolding process, establishing rules for a continent-wide land grab conducted without any African representation. This act of formalizing the division, ostensibly to prevent conflict among European powers, came at an immense cost to the African sovereignty and self-determination. The consequences for Africa were immediate and devastating, and their echoes continue to resonate in present-day Africa. The imposition of extractive economic system fundamentally restructured African economies, preventing indigenous industrialization and fostering a deep-seated dependency on primary commodity export that persists as a major impediment to diversified economic growth in Africa today. Politically, the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers with utter disregard for pre-existing African kingdoms or economies continue to hamper development in a way. Now, to go to Togo from Ghana, you have to secure a passport, and a lot of things happen at the border. This wasn't an African before the Berlin Conference. Anyway, let's continue. So this border continued to play an effective role in conflict or ethnic conflict across the continent. There are siblings or there are groups, ethnic groups in Ghana and some in Togo. So you have somebody living in Ghana with their family in Togo. You have somebody living in Rwanda with their family in Congo. All these were created by the scramble and partition of the African continent by the European powers. Anyway. Further, the colonial imposition of governance structure designed for external control rather than the welfare of African societies fostered weak state capacity and a deep mistrust between the populace and the state, contributing to ongoing political instability and challenges in democratic development. The widespread and diverse form of African resistance, though often brutally suppressed, underscore the agency and the resilience of African people in the face of overwhelming odds or adversity. However, the extreme violence employed by colonial powers, including genocidal campaign, starkly exposes the brutal reality behind the civilized nation. So in synthesis, the scramble for Africa is not merely a historical footnote, but a foundational event whose legacy continues to cast a significant shadow on contemporary African realities. Understanding this period is crucial for comprehending the continent's current economic structures, political challenges, and social dynamics. African nations continue to grapple with these inherited complexities, striving to overcome the enduring impact of this era and assert self-determination in an increasingly interconnected world. Anyway, so end today's episode here. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video. You can drop your comments as well. If you have any favorite topic you want us to treat, we'll consider treating it for you as well. So before we go, don't forget, one day our lives will become history. What will posterity say about you? See you in the next episode.